Thank you for joining me today. This is a topic that often sparks endless debate, but most of those debates miss something crucial. People think converting someone who doesn't believe in a God is just a matter of presenting the right argument, offering the perfect proof, or quoting a line that feels undeniable. But if you've ever seen those conversations play out, you know they rarely go anywhere. That's because they start from the wrong assumption. They assume disbelief is a misunderstanding that can be fixed by supplying more information. In reality, the reason attempts to convert atheists almost always fail isn't about logic alone. It's about something far deeper. When someone says they don't believe, that position isn't a casual oversight. It's usually the result of a long process of questioning, examining, and sometimes painful letting go. People often imagine disbelief as a gap, like a missing puzzle piece that can be filled with a verse or a personal testimony. But in most cases, it's the opposite. It's the outcome of connecting many pieces, noticing contradictions, and realizing the picture looks nothing like what they were told. That process takes time, and it builds a mindset that doesn't simply accept claims without evidence. So when someone tries to convert an atheist, they're not speaking to someone who hasn't thought about these questions. They're speaking to someone who has thought about them a lot. Think about what most conversion attempts rely on. Appeals to fear, warnings about eternal punishment. Appeals to authority, quotes from a holy book. Appeals to emotion, promises of love, hope, or meaning. These strategies can work on people already inclined to believe because they reinforce a framework they already trust. But for someone who's stepped outside that framework, those tactics don't just fail, they backfire. Fear doesn't persuade someone who no longer sees the threat as real. Quoting scripture doesn't work on someone who no longer accepts the text as authoritative. And emotional appeals often come across as attempts to manipulate rather than inform. The problem isn't hostility, it's mismatch. You can't use tools from inside a system to convince someone who has left the system behind. There's another reason conversion rarely works. Belief isn't just an idea, it's an identity, and so is disbelief. When someone grows up in a religious environment, belief shapes every part of life: family, community, rituals, morality. Leaving that system isn't just changing an opinion, it's restructuring an entire sense of self. Once that shift happens, going back isn't simply about arguments. It would mean unmaking a hard-won identity. And most people don't do that because of a conversation on a street corner or a debate on a message board. If anything, pushy attempts to reconvert often strengthen resistance because they feel like pressure to abandon autonomy. And autonomy is one of the things people value most after leaving belief behind. People also underestimate the role of evidence. For many believers, faith itself is a virtue. Believing without proof is seen as strength. But for those who've stepped away, the equation has changed. Faith without evidence isn't strength, it's risk. It's the risk of structuring your entire life around something that might not be true. And once someone sees belief as a claim that requires evidence, appeals to emotion or tradition sound hollow. They're looking for reasons grounded in reality, not reassurance or threats. And when those reasons don't come, when arguments rely on gaps in science, cherry-picked anecdotes, or circular reasoning, the attempt collapses under its own weight. There's also the question of diversity. People talk about atheists as if they're all the same, but disbelief isn't a single position, it's a spectrum. Some people are deeply interested in philosophy and science. Others simply live without religious frameworks because they never found them convincing. Some left after studying theology, others left after witnessing hypocrisy or harm. This diversity means there's no one-size-fits-all argument, because there's no one-size-fits-all reason for leaving. And that means any attempt to convert runs into another problem. It assumes people stopped believing for shallow reasons, when in fact the reasons are often layered, personal, and deeply thought through. Ironically, the more someone tries to convert, the clearer this becomes. If you watch these interactions online, you'll notice a pattern. The same points appear over and over, design arguments, morality arguments, appeals to tradition, and each time the responses are calm, detailed, and rooted in evidence. That's because disbelief trains you to ask questions and check claims. When you've gone through that process, the old arguments feel like echoes from another life, familiar but no longer persuasive. It's not about being stubborn. It's about having learned to measure ideas against reality instead of authority. What's fascinating is how this dynamic reveals something bigger about human nature. People want certainty, and when they find it, they assume everyone else needs it too. That's why believers often see conversion as a gift, something that will make someone's life better. They assume the problem is ignorance, not difference. But for those who don't believe, certainty isn't the goal. Understanding is. And understanding requires admitting when something isn't supported by evidence. That's why conversion efforts fail. They're built on the assumption that belief is the natural state and disbelief is a defect. But what if disbelief is simply the result of following the same questions to a different conclusion? As we go deeper in this discussion, we'll look at why these attempts persist, what they reveal about fear and control, and why the rise of secular thinking changes the rules of persuasion forever. Because the inability to convert isn't just about individuals, it's about a cultural shift that's redefining how people think about truth, morality, and meaning. When someone tries to convert another person, especially from disbelief to belief, they often believe they're doing something noble. They see it as saving a soul, rescuing someone from harm, offering eternal happiness. That's why these efforts are often persistent, even aggressive. But underneath that zeal is something more complex: fear. Fear of doubt, fear of uncertainty, and fear of losing what feels like ultimate truth. Because if disbelief spreads, it raises uncomfortable questions about their own convictions. Conversion isn't only about you, it's about reaffirming their own belief. If they can pull someone back in, it feels like proof that the system still works. When they fail, that failure isn't just yours, it threatens their sense of security. That's why the harder they try, the more hostile the conversation can become. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning, the tendency to defend what you want to be true, even when evidence points the other way. Believers engaged in conversion often don't analyze facts neutrally. They start from a conclusion: God exists, faith is true, and work backward, picking arguments that support it. This isn't dishonesty, it's human nature. We all do it in some way. But when your entire worldview depends on a claim, the bias becomes even stronger. That's why debates about religion feel different from debates about sports or movies. They're not just intellectual, they're existential. And that's also why trying to convert back an atheist almost always fails. The conversation isn't symmetrical. One side sees doubt as dangerous, the other sees doubt as necessary. Another factor that makes conversion attempts ineffective is the internet. 50 years ago, if you left religion, your circle was small and your resources were limited. Today, anyone with questions can access libraries of scholarship, science, philosophy, and critical analysis in seconds. They can watch debates, read historical critiques, and join communities where people share experiences openly. That changes everything. In the past, religious narratives could dominate by isolating people from alternative views. Now, that control is gone. If someone has already seen the strongest arguments for belief and found them lacking, repeating those arguments won't change their mind. If anything, it confirms that nothing new is on the table. This is why conversion tactics often sound outdated. Threats of eternal punishment don't resonate with someone who sees no evidence for an afterlife. Promises of eternal reward don't persuade someone who views those promises as inventions. And appeals to morality don't work when someone has discovered that ethics can exist and often flourish without religion. That's why these arguments feel hollow. They assume the very thing they're trying to prove. This is called circular reasoning, using the claim as its own evidence. The scripture is true because it says it's true. That may sound convincing within a faith system, but outside of it, it collapses instantly. Some might wonder, if conversion is so unlikely, why does it keep happening? Part of the answer is tradition. Many religions teach that spreading the message is a duty. It's not optional, it's a command. So even when the success rate is low, the attempt continues. But there's another layer: control. Societies that rely on religion for power see disbelief as a threat, because if people realize belief is optional, authority becomes fragile. That's why in some parts of the world, questioning faith is treated as a crime. Conversion isn't just about saving souls, it's about preserving systems. But here's what's really interesting. When conversion fails, it often creates the opposite effect. It pushes people further away. Because pressure feels like manipulation, and manipulation erodes trust. When someone feels that you're trying to override their autonomy, they don't lean in, they pull back. And that's why the rise of global connectivity is so significant. People are no longer trapped in echo chambers. They can compare notes, share stories, and see that disbelief isn't a moral failure. It's a common human response to evidence. That realization makes old conversion tactics not just ineffective, but irrelevant. As we continue, we'll explore how this shift is changing culture. Why are younger generations leaving religion faster than any before? Why are old methods of persuasion collapsing? And what does this mean for the future of belief? These aren't abstract questions. They shape politics, education, and personal identity. And the answers reveal a world where the power to convert no longer belongs to those who used to hold it. If you look at surveys worldwide, one trend is impossible to ignore. Younger generations are moving away from religion faster than any generation in recorded history. Sociologists call this the rise of the nones, people who answer none when asked about their religious affiliation. In some countries, these numbers are staggering. In the United States, nearly 30% of adults now identify as religiously unaffiliated, and that number climbs above 40% among younger adults. In Western Europe, secularization is even more advanced, and even in regions where religion has long dominated, cracks are showing. What's behind this shift? One reason is access to information. The internet did more to undermine traditional authority in a few decades than centuries of academic critique ever could. For most of human history, knowledge was controlled by institutions. If you wanted answers, you went to the village priest or the local holy text. Today, anyone with a smartphone can fact-check claims in seconds. If a preacher says the Earth is 6,000 years old, a teenager can find out that radiometric dating and astrophysics disagree. And they can see that evidence explained clearly without theological filters. This democratization of knowledge changes everything, because it removes the monopoly on truth that religions once held. But information alone doesn't explain it. There's a psychological dimension too. Younger generations are growing up in pluralistic societies where they see diverse beliefs living side by side. When your friends include Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and atheists, it becomes obvious that not everyone can be right, and that realization plants seeds of doubt. That doubt is compounded by exposure to moral diversity. When you see that people who reject your religion can still be kind, ethical, and compassionate, it challenges the claim that faith is the foundation of morality. And once that claim crumbles, the urgency to convert others weakens. This is why traditional conversion tactics, fear of hell, promises of paradise, don't work on many young people. Fear works best in isolation, when there's no competing narrative. But when you see entire communities living without fear of eternal punishment and thriving anyway, the spell breaks. The same is true for reward. Heaven sounds less compelling when you realize every religion offers its own version, and none can prove it. This diversity doesn't just dilute fear, it dilutes exclusivity. If salvation depends on joining one group, but thousands of groups claim the same thing, the logic collapses. What's even more striking is the resilience of disbelief once it takes root. Studies show that people who leave religion rarely return. They might experiment with spirituality or adopt loose beliefs, but full reconversion is rare. Why? Because the process of leaving often involves dismantling deeply ingrained fears. Once you overcome the terror of hell or the pressure of divine judgment, you don't easily slip back. It's like learning that monsters under the bed aren't real. Once the illusion is gone, you can't force yourself to believe again, no matter how much someone insists. That's why debates about evidence often miss the point. For many, the emotional architecture of belief, the fear, the guilt, the sense of dependency, has collapsed. And without that architecture, the structure can't stand. Another reason conversion fails is that it relies on authority, and authority is losing its grip. Religious leaders once had cultural dominance. Today, they compete with scientists, philosophers, educators, and influencers. And authority without evidence doesn't hold in a world trained to ask for receipts. When someone says, "Believe because the Holy Book says so," the natural response now is, "Why should I trust that book?" That question was once unthinkable. Today, it's common. And that shift isn't reversible because once a culture normalizes doubt, it becomes a permanent feature. This cultural shift also explains why attempts to paint disbelief as immoral no longer work. In the past, religious institutions claimed a monopoly on virtue. Now, evidence shows that secular societies often rank higher on measures of well-being: lower crime, greater equality, stronger education. That doesn't mean religion causes harm by default, but it destroys the myth that morality collapses without faith. When people see this in data and in their own lives, the fear narrative loses its teeth. And when fear disappears, so does the leverage behind most conversion strategies. In the next section, we'll look at what this means for the future of religion. Is conversion as a practice dying? Are faith traditions shifting their focus from persuasion to retention? And what happens when more people realize that autonomy, rather than obedience, is the foundation of meaning? Because that realization is shaping a future where belief is a choice, not a default. And that changes the game forever. Religions have always evolved to survive, and in today's world, that evolution is accelerating. Leaders in many faith traditions know conversion doesn't work the way it once did. Street preaching, door-to-door evangelism, even elaborate debates. These methods feel outdated in an age where people can instantly verify claims or watch world-class scholars dismantle arguments online. In response, some religions have shifted strategies. Instead of trying to win outsiders, they focus on retaining insiders. You'll see this in the growing emphasis on keeping young people in the faith through private schools, tight-knit communities, and social reinforcement, because they know once someone steps outside the circle and sees the world through a wider lens, bringing them back is nearly impossible. But even these strategies have limits. Young people value autonomy, individuality, and authenticity more than any generation before. They question authority not because they're rebellious, but because they've been taught to think critically. Schools encourage analysis, technology rewards curiosity, and when you apply those habits to religious claims, cracks appear quickly. A generation raised on instant access to global knowledge doesn't respond well to just have faith. It feels like a command without justification. And commands without reasons don't hold power for long. This rise of autonomy explains why conversion has lost its grip. Conversion depends on submission, accepting someone else's framework for truth. But modern identity is built on self-determination. People want to choose their values, not inherit them blindly. They want beliefs that withstand scrutiny, not beliefs they have to protect from questions. And when those beliefs fail the test of evidence, people walk away. That's not arrogance, it's intellectual consistency. You can't demand honesty in every area of life and then make faith the one exception. Of course, some argue that without religion, society will collapse. They say morality needs God, meaning needs heaven, and order needs sacred rules. But look around. The most secular nations on earth, places like Sweden, Norway, Japan, are among the safest, most stable, and most compassionate. They didn't achieve that by preaching more, they achieved it by investing in education, fairness, and human dignity. That's the irony. The very things people fear will vanish without faith often thrive when people rely on reason and empathy instead of dogma. And when that reality becomes obvious, the appeal of conversion shrinks even further. This brings us to the deepest reason you can't convert atheists. They've seen behind the curtain. They've experienced the mechanics of belief, how it's reinforced by repetition, fear, and community, and they've stepped outside it. Once you understand those dynamics, the spell is broken. You can appreciate the comfort religion brings without confusing comfort for truth. And when truth becomes the priority, persuasion loses its old weapons. Fear doesn't work, authority doesn't work, tradition doesn't work, only evidence works. And when evidence isn't there, the conversation ends. So, is conversion dead? Not entirely. There will always be people who move in and out of belief for personal reasons. But as a cultural force, conversion is losing power. The future belongs to questions, not creeds. It belongs to people willing to live with uncertainty rather than cling to illusions. And that's why converting those who've embraced that freedom isn't just hard, it's nearly impossible. Because once someone learns to think without fear, no promise of heaven or threat of hell can make them surrender that freedom again. Thank you for listening to this discussion. If you've stayed this far, it means you value honest conversation, and that matters. Share your thoughts below. Do you think attempts to convert will disappear in the next generation? Or will new strategies emerge? I'd love to hear your perspective.